Thank you for joining us today on the Welcome to We Show. Welcome to We Show is a part of We the World, which was founded by Rick Ulfik over 25 years ago. It provides a vehicle for connection, interaction, and opportunity for unprecedented collaboration between people, organizations, and movements. It promotes the shift from I to we. You can find out more about We the World on we.net. So thank you again for joining us. I'm Robert Levine. I'm the editor of Trends in Global Grassroots Organizing, which you can take a look at trends.we.net. And happy to have as our guest today, Patrick Carolan. Patrick has been a longtime friend of both We the World and Trends. He's had numerous articles in Trends over the years. We've recently celebrated our 5th anniversary issue, which includes Patrick's article. The 5th anniversary issue focuses on the environment, a critical issue, not just today, not just one quarter out of the year, but every day, especially as we face unprecedented global change. Again, just to introduce Patrick, he's an activist, organizer, writer, and he's now a podcaster. And Patrick will tell us more about his podcast as we talk. So, Patrick, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here with you, Robert, and with everyone in the We family. And I very much enjoy writing for you and just spending time with you all.
Thank you. Same here. So I always love your articles. I truly do. They take a very comprehensive, holistic approach to the issue. Anyone who knows Patrick knows he's been very active as a Franciscan in the Franciscan Action Network, which of course is in the tradition of St. Francis. So I'll let Patrick speak to this, but there's been such a deep connection between St. Francis and the environment. But Patrick, one of the things I loved about your article is you really took a moment to show that this is not just a problem we're facing today. This has been an issue that goes back hundreds of years, if not longer. And you speak about some of the warnings that were given as early as the late 19th century, if not before. So could you speak to that a bit?
Oh, sure, I'd love to. And I think in thinking about, what I defined as our ecological crisis, and it's a term that we hear a lot. And for me, I've been involved in the climate movement for a long time. I co-founded the Global Catholic Climate Movement and worked on many other within that capacity, many other climate organizations. But it goes even deeper than that. A lot of times, folks within the climate movement and the ecological movement, still, particularly the faith climate movement, because that's where most of where my work has been engaged in. And people look at and think about it from the perspective of the term that comes up a lot is called care for creation. And we always use that. I actually even years ago developed a program called Care for Creation. But as time went on, I began to understand a little differently, particularly around St. Francis and what he believed and what he taught. Today, still within, particularly in Christianity, but in most religions, we have this understanding that we have the responsibility to protect, to steward, and to nurture the natural world as God's gift. This understanding has created a hierarchical system. It's created a system that sort of puts us at the top, and we're responsible for the rest of everyone else, the rest of creation. Around 60 years ago, there was a man named Lynn White Lynn White was not an environmentalist. He was not a scientist. He was actually a cultural historian. But he wrote an article about at the time, it wasn't the climate movement, but it was the environmental problems that we were facing or going to be facing. And in his article, he said the problem of our environmental problem, the main part of it is a theological problem from the Christianity perspective. The whole understanding that we have as Christians, and again, it's not just Christians, but most of my work is centered around Christianity. But the whole understanding that we have that our whole purpose here on earth is to get to heaven. And so everything we do here is important only insofar as it helps us get to heaven. St. Francis taught a whole different understanding of that. St. Francis believed that we were all brothers to creation, sisters to creation, that we were all connected. He believes in the interconnectedness of all creation, and that our purpose wasn't to get to heaven. Our purpose was to create heaven here on earth. And so the question is, how do we go about creating that heaven here on earth? I wrote this article for you. I wrote another article a couple of years ago. And in it, I started it out by asking a simple question. I said, suppose when you woke up this morning, you went about your whatever your morning routine is. Maybe you meditated or prayed. Maybe you took a walk, you fed the dog, had a cup of coffee, and then you decided to sit down at your computer and check your emails. And you opened your emails up, and there was an email that said, "This is God." And for your first response probably would have been that, this is some kind of a scam. I'm not going to open it. But then your curiosity got the better of you. So you opened up that email and it said, Robert, this is God. I'm writing because I've decided that it's time to get serious about creating heaven on earth. And I'm wondering if you could help. I'm wondering if you could think about what you as an individual need to do and what everyone in society needs to do to create heaven on earth. And then I went on to write more about that, and I wrote it and I said, what would your response to God be? What would you say to God if God said to you, how can you help me create heaven on earth? Um, and so I think we have to have this whole new understanding of who we are in relationship to creation. One of the things that St. Francis and later, about 50 years after Francis, there was a theologian, John Duns Scotus. He was a Franciscan friar from Scotland, a Scottish theologian, considered one of our most brilliant medieval theologians and philosophers. And I have to be upfront and honest about this. I don't understand a single word he says. I've read most of his work and I can't understand any of it. But one of the things he wrote about what he called was the univocity of being. And he described that as the understanding of the how the uniqueness of each of us, each part of creation coming together to form the oneness of all creation. And it was fascinating to me as I was doing some research and I looked back in 50 years before Scotus wrote that, there was a Sufi mystic who wrote almost the same identical thing. And if you go back in time, you go back several thousand years ago, you'll hear the early Hindus in the Sanskrit that they wrote. It was in there. Thus, this whole understanding of the oneness, how we're all connected to each other. It's the belief that a lot of our indigenous cultures had, our early indigenous, whether they be the Aboriginal culture in Australia or the first Americans here in the Americas, or even my own culture. I'm Irish. My parents were from Ireland, and so the Celtic culture, which I came from, they have all had this belief that we were all part of the oneness of Earth, and all creation was connected through oneness and through God, if you say, or however you describe God. We've gone away from that. We've moved far away from that today. And for the last several hundred years, we've been moving far away from that. And now we've created a society, a culture where we're at the top and we're in control, and everything else below us is there to serve us. So we have to move away from that if we're going to really solve this environmental crisis that we're in right now. We don't have a lot of time left. We have a couple hundred years max, probably a lot less than that, before there's not many of us around, before all get destroyed. And so we really have to change. It's not just about, it's important to ask people to be conscious of the environment, to take care of the environment, to not litter, to do all those things. But we need a whole spiritual transformation as well. And that spiritual transformation is how we see ourselves in relationship to the rest of creation.
Right. What I particularly found fascinating, I'd never, kind of thought about this, but, having been trained in political theory, I'm very familiar with Aquinas.
Hmm.
And so I was reading in the article how Aquinas, who very much had the traditional view that humans are stewards of nature, we are to be dominant of it. And then you also mentioned sort of a dichotomy between him and Saint Bonaventure.
Yes.
And as you write, that he developed a theology of creation.
Hmm. Hmm. Yes. And Bonaventure was a Franciscan. Interesting little side note on that. They both attended the University of Paris, and and from what I can gather and what I've read is they lived together while they were
Hmm.
attending the University of Paris. They're at the same age, same time period. I, I think sometimes it would have been fascinating to like sit there while they were having dinner, drinking wine, and listening to their conversations because they're both brilliant theologians and philosophers. Um, but Aquinas' whole theology was centered on the whole idea of separation, of
Mhm.
dualism, of that, there's a God, there's us, and God created the rest of creation for us. And so we have power over the rest of creation. Bonaventure's whole theology and philosophy was centered around the oneness of all of us, which he got from Francis, and also from a lot of the Sufis, writers of that time and other cultures. But it's all about the interconnectedness of all of us. And so there is, in Bonaventure's view, there is no hierarchical structure. There's just all of us together, coming together. And, again, they both have contributed a tremendous amount to our theology and philosophy today. But, there's always the other part of it is, and it's something my good friend Elia Delio writes about a lot. And Elia says that we should understand and remember that our sacred stories, our spiritual stories, they're wonderful stories, and they're full of richness and meaning. But we have to remember that they were written in a time when we had a whole different understanding of the cosmos. And so, there's an old Irish expression, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Mhm.
I'm really glad my mother followed that expression. Um, but this whole idea of the oneness and reimagining our sacred stories, our spiritual stories with our new understanding of the cosmos. And again, we often talk about science and how much spirituality. I hear people say this all the time. Well, our spirituality, our religion has to catch up to our science. And I often think that our science actually has to catch up to our spirituality, because the whole understanding in science, new understanding that Elia has written about and others have written a lot about the whole idea of quantum entanglement, and and this the quantum physics and this whole idea that through quantum physics where everything is connected and I do
Mhm.
something here, it could affect something 1,000 miles away. Um, and we think that's a brilliant new concept, but that's not any different than what the Hindus taught and what the Hindus
Mhm.
wrote about 3,000, 4,000 years ago in their Vedic writings. It's not any different than Scotus talked about. That's the same understanding that Scotus did, not from a science perspective, but from a spirituality perspective. So while it's certainly true that if we're going to go forward, our spirituality has to have a new understanding based on our new understanding of science, but our science also has to have an understanding of the spirituality, and we sort of have to figure out a way to come together if we're going to go forward.
Right. So often, especially, and these are people who are very concerned about the environment. The answer I get when I have conversations with them is they understand the danger to the world, the danger to the future generations, but it's hard for a lot of people to understand the relationship to themselves. So
Mhm.
there's one quote, Richard Rohr, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly,
Yes, you are.
where he talks about so basically when we separate ourselves from the world, we are separating us from all of creation, from God, from the infinite love of God.
Mhm.
So it's like it provides an even deeper spiritual creation. Why don't, if you could speak a little more about that?
Yeah, yeah, and Richard Rohr is a Franciscan, and a lot of his theology, all of his theology comes from Saint Francis and from Scotus and Bonaventure and the early Franciscan scholars, and again, it's this understanding that, like, and Richard Rohr writes a lot about it. Elia Delia writes a lot about it. Is this understanding of love, and that all of creation is centered around love. And not to understand creation being centered around love is to not to understand love. And without love, and without the connectedness of all of us through love, then we're just all going to be living in a dualistic, separate world where, for me, my whole purpose would be I have to do good here so I can get to heaven, because then in heaven something might be better. And Rohr and Delia and others sort of disavow that whole theology, that philosophy, and talk about the understanding of creation is centered around love, and all of creation is connected to each other through love. And if we don't operate on love and out of love, then we're really missing the boat. We're not really following, we're not certainly not following the teachings of Jesus. We're not following the teachings of Buddha. We're not following the teachings of the Quran. We're not following the teachings of any of our sacred scriptures and books, um, if we're not centered around love. And you can't have a understanding centered around love and go out and hate people and go out
Mhm.
and it's not just people. You can't do that and go out and, destroy the environment. You can't destroy um, God's beautiful and wondrous and glorious creation centered on love and then claim to be a follower of God.
Right. So yeah, so basically that, I think that becomes so important because it shows the ramifications of our, whether, the ramifications of our actions, but it's more than just our actions. It's how we interact with each other,
Mhm.
with the natural world in terms of, well, certainly animals, but even
Mhm.
reaction to just how we treat the environment around us.
Mhm. Yeah, we again, centering a lot of what I say around Christianity, but it's true in Islam, it's true in Hinduism, it's true in almost every spiritual teaching. Is we think sometimes that we want to become one with God, and in order to do that, we first have to be in right relationship with God. And we do that by praying a certain way or holding our hands a certain way or believing in certain beliefs. And that'll help us to get in right relationship with God. So that when we die, then we'll go to heaven because we're in right relationship with that God. The reality is that we should be in right relationship with all of God's beautiful creation. And again, we do that not by being protectors of it, by being caring and loving for creation, with creation. And so we have to first be in right relationship with all of creation. And then when we're in right relationship with all of creation, then we're already in right relationship with God. But we will never be in right relationship with God until we're in right relationship with all of God's creation.
Right. You give a quote from the late Pope Francis.
Mhm.
Um, so he was so in what you paraphrase, he was calling us to move forward, but but it's described as in a bold cultural revolution.
Yes. Yes, and again, kind of interesting because Pope Francis was a Jesuit, although he took the name after Saint Francis. I'll digress real quickly for a second. I got to meet Pope Francis a couple times, and when you get to meet a pope, you get 2 minutes, 3 minutes, shake his hands. And so I was thinking, well, what am I going to say to Pope Francis in the 3 minutes that I have when I'm meeting him? And I decided I would tell him a joke. I mean, everybody else is going up and saying, "Oh, Pope Francis, you're so wonderful. Thank you, blah, blah, blah." I thought, oh, he's human. I'll tell him a joke. And so the joke I told him was that, Pope Francis, when he first got elected Pope, and he was a Jesuit, and so a lot of us that are part of the Franciscan family, we were asked how we felt about that, about a Jesuit taking the name of Pope Francis. And my response was that, well, all of us in our youth and through our youthful exuberance have made mistakes and errors. And we're so grateful that our Holy Father, as he got older and wiser, saw the error of his ways. So I told that joke to Pope Francis. Um, he actually liked it a lot. He laughed a lot about it. So, but Pope Francis had this understanding, both from being a Jesuit priest and also from understanding St. Francis and who St. Francis was. And I think a lot of his understanding came from where he came from. He lived in Argentina, and he was connected to nature back when he was a young boy. He was actually a scientist before he became a priest, and so he understood the science of it before he understood the spirituality of it. And when he talks about a bold cultural revolution, he's talking about a revolution of spirit, a new understanding of who we are in relationship to all creation. He's not talking about a revolution of guns, but it really is this revolution of spirit and a new understanding of our spiritual stories, our sacred stories, um, centered around this love, the understanding that of love, and that everything is about love. And if you're not operating out of love, then you're really not operating out of God. And you again, and I've said this before, and I say it again, and I say it over and over again to people, you can't hate your brother and then say you love God. You just can't do that. And you can't discriminate against your brother. You can't have your brother arrested and shipped to another country somewhere just because he's a different color if you then make a claim that you love God, because you don't. You love some concept of God that's going to judge you up in heaven, but you don't really love what God is, and because God is love. And
Right,
that's, it's as simple as that. And that's the cultural revolution that Pope Francis is talking about, is a revolution of all of us coming together out of love and in love with all of creation.
right. So Patrick, I also would like to spend a little time talking a little bit about your new podcast.
Yes. So would I.
Okay, please tell us more about it.
Yes, so as you know, I'm a writer and have been for a number of years. Although I will tell you a little story about that too. When I was a senior in high school, my high school English teacher told me that whatever I do, I should never take up writing. He said, you have no concept of writing. You don't know where to put a period or a comma. So whatever, you should become an auto mechanic or something like that. So I want to look him up today and tell him, see what I've accomplished. But um, our new podcast and it's with two colleagues of mine, Michael Centauri, who was the editor of Today's American Catholic, and my good friend Barbara Maricondo, who's a writer. Um, and editor, and we came together and decided to do a podcast and a Substack platform called Tomorrow's American Catholic. In our podcast, we interview guests. We do a weekly podcast, and each week we have a different guest on. And we have had Kurt Johnson on. We've had Bishop John Stowe on. We had a Catholic sister from Kenya who runs the African Human Trafficking Coalition, Anti-Human Trafficking Coalition. And we've had everyday ordinary people on. And what we're asking is, we're not interested that much in what you've accomplished. We're interested in how your faith and your spirituality has helped you accomplish what you've accomplished, and how your faith and spirituality has changed because of what you've accomplished, and how what you're accomplishing and what you're doing in your work is changing because of your faith and spirituality, how connected they are. And we've had conversations with poets and musicians and activists and writers, and as I said, just ordinary people. And it's just fascinating to hear their stories about their faith and their spirituality, and what helped them to accomplish what they've accomplished. So I welcome you all to join us on Tomorrow's American Catholic. We're also on Apple Podcasts. We recently received a note saying that we're one of the fastest growing faith and justice podcasts around the globe. And we've only been doing it about 6 months now. So I
Oh,
think that's pretty good.
that's
And
exciting.
for me, I mean, you know me pretty well, so you know that I actually love to talk to people. So I mean, what could
Mhm.
be better to be able to spend an hour with people and ask them a simple question? And just just an interesting side note about that. Um, I was recently in Ann Arbor, Michigan. My daughter lives there, and so my wife and I went to visit, and we were at the Ann Arbor Arts Festival. Huge. It's one of the largest art festivals in the country. And I was walking around, and everybody has their booths there, and different artists and all different types of mediums. They're showing their work. They're obviously trying to sell their work. And I'd go in, and if there wasn't a lot of people there with them, I'd start chatting with them. And I asked these artists the same question. I asked them, can you tell me about your spirituality, your faith, and how that's affected your work, how that's helped, encouraged your work? And I got these, most interesting answers from people who are more than willing to share their stories with me. I got some of their names, so we're going to try to get a couple of them on our podcast at some point. But it's one of those things that people don't talk about. Um, we had a guy on recently, Dan Horan. I don't know if you know Dan's work. Dan's a
Mhm.
Franciscan, brilliant, brilliant, brilliant writer, theologian, one of the probably leading Franciscan theologians in the country today. He's up there on par with Richard Rohr and Ilia Delio. And I know that because I asked AI who are the three most influential Franciscan theologians, and they gave me those three names. Um, and Dan's also a good friend of mine. So we had him on, and I asked him that question, and he just stopped for a second, and he said to me, and all I've been interviewed 1,000 times. I've been traveled all over. I've written all this stuff. Nobody has ever asked me that question. And he was just so excited to be able to answer that question. So
Yeah, because as I think any artist will tell you, I'm a poet, playwright. I also sing, and I know that my creative work is my spiritual work.
exactly.
That's where I feel closest to the divine when I'm
Yes.
doing that.
Yes.
There's a spark of inspiration that I believe is in every single being on this planet, be they human, or anything, even within a plant and a tree.
Yes.
There's a spark of the divine, and
Yes.
that's how I access mine.
Mhm.
So
And I think it's not just that you're accessing it, and I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but I believe knowing you and having seen some of your work is that it's out of love that you share it with
mhm,
the world. And it's
yes.
that you're sharing, when you share your artwork, when Rick shares his music, when a poet shares their poet, they're sharing their spirituality.
Yeah, I'd say that's very true.
So, and again, I'm an activist. I wish I was an artist sometimes, but I'm not. I'm an activist, and I'm really good at organizing. Um, and when I am an activist, when I'm protesting, when I'm doing whatever it is, I'm sharing my spirituality.
Mhm.
And so we all, and my wife is a nurse. When she's caring for patients,
Very
she's
much
sharing
so.
her
Yeah.
spirituality and her faith. And we're all doing that out of love with to each other and with each other. And that's how we come together as one.
Well, I still remember, I've been an activist on and off over the years, and I still remember share a story of a friend of mine. He was doing civil disobedience at the Shoreham nuclear power plant.
Mm.
And the police officer who came to arrest him said, "Excuse me, my back is really hurting. I have a very bad back. Could you just walk with me to the police wagon? Because if I have to lift you, it's really going to
Yeah.
hurt myself."
Yeah.
So my friend went, "Of course. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, of course I will." And they engaged in conversation.
Yes.
And the person shared with him that he was really scared by this nuclear power plant. And
Hmm.
while he was doing his job, he appreciated what my friend was doing
Yes.
by standing up for people and bringing this to everyone's attention and trying to make a difference while he couldn't. And that
Hmm.
his spirituality was very dedicated to enforcing the law. And that's how he shared his spirituality. So
Yes.
everyone shares it in a different way.
Yeah, and that's so true. And I love that story about your friend. I did a lot of nonviolent civil disobedience in Washington, D.C., and often at the Capitol. And so I got to know a lot of the Capitol Police. And I have to say, when January 6th came, I was heartbroken by that because I knew some of those police officers there. But they were such nice people. And, we would meet with them ahead of time. We would explain what we were doing and why we were doing it. We were nonviolent and we were very clear. Nobody can participate with us unless they first go through our nonviolent training.
Right.
And and we would go and kneel down and pray or whatever it is we were going to do, and then they'd come and they'd arrest us. Um, and they were doing their job. They put handcuffs on us and walked us out, and it was fine. It was very peaceful. And then, we'd go into the police, down to the police department. We'd get processed. We'd get released. And then there was a bar not that far from the U.S. Capitol that we would go over to, and some of the state police were over there after work having a drink, and we'd go have a drink with them. And so, it was, and some of them thanked us for what we were doing. And they said, and I mean, there was one guy in particular who said, first of all, I appreciate what I can't do this. Same thing your friend said. I can't do this because of what I do. But I thank you for doing that. And he also said, and I really thank you for your dedication to being nonviolent.
Hmm.
And that's so important. And I think that nonviolence has to play over into everything we do in our life. And that's part of the whole understanding of environmental justice is the nonviolence part of it, and in everything we do. And it's not just physical violence. I think we have to be verbally nonviolent to people. And even within our thoughts, we should be, nonviolent in our thoughts. Um, that's when the transformation is going to happen. And I actually think we're in the middle of a transformation right now. Um, and that out of this, something much greater is going to happen. We're going to finally start to understand that we're here together, connected to each other, and that we're here out of love for each other and with each other. And we're not here to go to heaven. We're here to create that heaven here.
Thank you. That's a lovely sentiment, Patrick.
Mhm.
I don't think it could be better said. So, first of all, I want to thank you again
Mhm.
for joining us this evening. As I said, you're a phenomenal friend of We the World, and I enjoy every time we get a chance to talk. So,
Yes, and
thank you for
I,
coming on.
I'm always happy to come on, and I very much enjoy talking with you, and I love the work that Rick's doing and been doing for more than 20 years now, and trying to bring together. And as I said earlier, anything I can do to help, anything our Tomorrow's American Catholic Substack platform can do to help, um, happy to do that. Happy to share it with you, and I'm also happy to share all of the information that y'all are doing to our audience, our followers.
Thank you. I also want to remind the audience that we're coming up to the 11 Days of Global Unity. That'll start on September 11th and run through September 21st, the International Day of Peace. They can find out more information about that at we.net, as well as about We the World and about Rick and his work. And of course, Trends magazine, trends.we.net. So Patrick, once again, thank you for being a part of all this. And I look forward to when we speak again soon.
Thank you so much. It's been a joy and a pleasure to be with you, as
Same
always.
here. Okay, thank you.